Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite kings out of the Old Testament, King Hezekiah. This is my favorite story for a couple of reasons. The big one will be at the end when I share a couple of things with you. But Hezekiah reminds us that just because you're faithful doesn't mean that everything's going to go well. I'm reminded of an old preacher saying that you can have big problems or you can have a big God, but you can't have both. Well, I disagree with that statement. I think you can have a big God and still have some pretty big problems. And Hezekiah was a very faithful king of Israel, and he had some pretty big problems. But God came through in an amazing way. And just the power of God and the way God came through makes this one of my favorite stories. So let me give you a little background. You'll find the story of King Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles, chapters 29 through 32. We're going to focus on 32 today. But let me just say something about 29, 30, and 31. Assyria was one of the most powerful nations in the world. They were one of the first big world-dominating empires. It started Assyria, then it went Babylonia, then Persia, Greek, and Roman. And they were the first one that was this super empire that literally controlled their known world. And they were a brutal people, and Sennacherib, their king, was a ruthless man, and he wanted North Israel and South Judah for his own. And early on in his reign, he took North Israel, and then he started coming down toward South Judah. Now, Hezekiah comes in at 25 years old, I believe, and reigned for 29 years, and he was a faithful king throughout his whole life. And here's the amazing thing about Hezekiah. When he got there in his early years, he immediately began to undo the things that his father had done. In chapter 29, he reopened the temple. In chapter 29, he started the sacrificial system back, where they started sacrificing back to God again. In verse 29, he reinstituted worship back into the temple. In chapter 30, he reinstituted the Passover. So under his dad and some previous kings, Judah had pretty well quit worshiping God. And so when Hezekiah became king, he said, okay, forget everything else. Here's what we're going to do first. We're coming back to God. They celebrated Passover. He cleaned up the temple and reopened it. They started worshiping again. They started sacrificing again. He brought God back into the life of the Israelites. And in fact, the author's conclusion to Hezekiah's reign is found in chapter 31, verses 20 and 21. It says, in this way, King Hezekiah handled the distribution throughout all Judah, doing what was pleasing and good in the sight of the Lord his God. In all that he did in the service of the temple of God and in all his efforts to follow the law and the commandments, Hezekiah sought his God wholeheartedly. As a result, he was very successful. So what a great pedigree. I mean, if you're giving him a report card, this guy's making an A on his report card. He did everything he needed to do, followed God wholeheartedly, and so God made him a success. But that didn't mean that it was without problems. And so here comes the problem, and the problem is Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. So we're going to pick this up in chapter 32, verse 1. After Hezekiah had faithfully carried out this work, King Sennacherib of Assyria invaded Judah. He laid siege to the fortified cities, giving orders for his army to break through their walls. When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib also intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted his officials and military advisors, and they decided to stop the flow of the springs outside the city. They organized a huge work crew to stop the flow of the springs, cutting off the brook that ran through the fields, for they said, why should the king of Assyria come here and find plenty of water? Then Hezekiah further strengthened his defenses by repairing the wall where it was broken down, and by adding to the fortifications and constructing a second wall outside the first. He also reinforced the Millo in the city of David and manufactured large numbers of weapons and shields. He appointed military officers over the people and asked them to assemble before him at the square at the city gate. Then Hezekiah encouraged them with this address, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid of the king of Assyria and his mighty army, for there is a power far greater on our side. He may have a great army, but they're just men. We have the Lord our God to help us and fight our battles for us. These words greatly encouraged the people. So here's what I love about Hezekiah. Hezekiah, through this whole thing, believed in God, worshiped God, walked with God, trusted with God, but that didn't mean he sat on the couch waiting for God to show up and rescue him. When he found out Sennacherib was coming, He knew that Sennacherib was taking some northern towns. He knew he was headed that way. He knew he had some time, and so here's what he did. Number one, he shut off the water flow out of Jerusalem into the desert. Why? It's the middle of the desert. It's hot there. If Sennacherib comes in and he has no water, it shortens the war. It shortens the attack. Sennacherib only has a few days without water to attack Jerusalem, and if he can't get Jerusalem in a few days, he'll have to retreat because there's no water. Second, Hezekiah finished building the wall of Jerusalem, not really building, but repairing it where it needed to be repaired, and then built a second wall outside the first wall. Well, why did he do that? He knew Sennacherib had a huge army and was more powerful than he was, but he says, okay, if I cut off the water, and he's only got 7 to 10 days to get us, and then he hits the first wall and has to break through the first wall, then he has to hit the second wall and get through the second wall. What Hezekiah was doing is he was just making sure that Sennacherib, if everything didn't go perfectly, was not going to be able to get through before he ran out of water. And then, of course, he made shields, he armed the people, he got the army ready, and then what did he do? He called the people together and said, hey, listen, let me tell you something. Sennacherib's coming, and we know he's the most powerful king in the world, and we've heard stories about how wicked the Assyrian army is and how hard they are to beat and how they destroy everybody in their path, but they're just men, and they're nothing compared to God, our God. And so we've made all the provisions. We've done everything we can do, and so now we're going to wait on God to do what he does. And what's he going to do? He's going to rescue us because we're his people, and we trust him, and we rely on him, and we believe in him, and so God is going to deliver. So really what I want you to notice, and this is one of my favorite things about this story, this is one of the things that makes this story so special to me, is I want you to notice the balance of the man of God. He's trusting in God, but he's not sitting doing nothing. He's planning, he's organizing, he's putting things in place while he's trusting God that God is going to work through the process for his glory. And I think that is a really important lesson for us to learn as men of God. Trusting in God doesn't mean I quit working. Trusting in God doesn't mean I don't plan well. Trusting in God doesn't mean I don't strategize and use my brain to set things up to be as successful as possible. Trusting in God means I bring God into the middle of that, into my plans and into the strategies and into the hard work, and trust that God's going to use that for his glory and my good. And so there's this balance of the man of God. And so what I want to do is I want us just to stop right now, and I want you to talk about that. I've got a couple of questions for you here. I want you to talk about Hezekiah's plan, what impresses you about that plan. You might want to reread these scriptures and think through it, and then think through how men of God are balanced between what they're doing and strategizing and working hard, and yet bringing God in as the one that supplies all of our needs and the one that we rely on. So talk about that. We'll come back and wrap the story up in a few minutes. So let's jump back into the text here in 2 Chronicles 32 and finish up this story. Sennacherib, the most powerful king in the world, a very wicked man, a very hard man, is now coming to take Jerusalem. He's taken many other major cities. That is not a big deal to him. This is just another small country and a small town that he's going to absorb into his powerful kingdom. And so when Sennacherib comes, he actually sends some messengers ahead of him. They speak in the language of the Jews, the Hebrew language, and they basically do psychological warfare. He lets them know that they don't have a chance up against him, almost letting them know if they want to surrender up front, they won't have to die. So I want to read this to you because it's so interesting how Sennacherib does this. Beginning in verse 9 of chapter 32, then King Sennacherib of Assyria, while still besieging the town of Lachish, which was up north, sent officials to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah and all the people. Now what I want you to notice is they don't come in and deliver a letter. They stand outside the walls and shout the message to the people so that everyone hears it to bring fear to the people. It says, "This is what King Sennacherib of Assyria says. What are you trusting in that makes you think you can survive my siege of Jerusalem? What are you trusting in? What are you thinking? Hezekiah has said to you, the Lord our God will rescue us from the king of Assyria. Surely Hezekiah is misleading you, sentencing you to death by famine and thirst. Surely you must realize that Hezekiah is the very person who destroyed all the Lord's shrines and altars. He commanded Judah and Jerusalem to worship at the only altar in the temple and to make sacrifices on it alone. So one of the things Sennacherib is doing here is he's telling the people of Jerusalem, look, you don't need to be following Hezekiah. Hezekiah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He is misleading you, and he's going to lead you to your death. He said, let me give you an example. You had all of these gods from all of these nations. And you know what Hezekiah did? He went and knocked them all down and is only having you worship one God. Well, if he does that, and you only have one God to rely on, you can't imagine all the gods I have to rely on. You don't have a chance up against me if you're only relying on one God. See, he misunderstood. He misunderstood that what Hezekiah was doing was knocking out all the false idols and the false gods to follow the one true God. In Sennacherib's mind, he was just minimizing religion and minimizing the gods. And so, of course, we know that will come back to bite Sennacherib. So he says, surely you must realize what I and the other kings of Assyria before me have done to all the peoples of the earth. Were any of the gods of those nations able to rescue their people from my power? Name just one time when any God anywhere was able to rescue his people from me. So what makes you think that your God will do any better? See, he just throws Jehovah God in with all the other idols and said, nobody's been able to stop me before. No God's going to stop me. Pride. He puts himself in the place of God. So then he goes on and says, don't let Hezekiah fool you. Don't let him deceive you like this. I say it again, no God of any nation has ever been able to rescue his people from me or my ancestors. How much less will your God rescue you from my power? He just shook his fist at the Almighty God and challenged him and says, your God isn't going to do any better against me than any of the other gods. Wow. It continues on and says, and Sennacherib's officials further mocked the Lord God and his servant Hezekiah. I like that word. That's exactly what they're doing, is mocking God, heaping insult upon insult. The king also sent letters scorning the Lord, the God of Israel. He wrote, just as the gods of all the other nations failed to rescue their people from my power, so the God of Hezekiah will also fail. The Assyrian officials who brought the letter shouted this in the Hebrew language, so the people gathered on the walls of the city, trying to terrify them so it would be easier to capture the city. These officials talked about the God of Jerusalem as though he were one of the pagan gods made by human hands. So just imagine that. For days on end, these guys are yelling these insults about God and about Hezekiah's leadership, and they're all going to die, and everyone's died before them, and they're not going to be any different. Just creating fear in the life of these people. So here it comes. One of my favorite stories ever. Verse 20, then King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, cried out in prayer to God in heaven. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed the Assyrian army with all its commanders and officers. Now, this story is also recorded in 1 Kings. It's also recorded in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah was the prophet here. And we find out that the Lord sent an angel, one angel, and destroyed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. Now I want you to imagine this. Imagine Sennacherib sitting down with his commanders the night before and saying, okay, tomorrow we're taking Jerusalem. I don't think this is going to be a big deal. I know they've cut off the water supply, but we should get through them in a couple of days and we'll be going home with another major city under our belt. So no big deal. Go get some sleep, and we'll get this thing started tomorrow. So Sennacherib goes to sleep, and the next morning he wakes up, and apparently there are some people left, but when he looks out, all of his officers and all of his commanders and all of his soldiers are dead. 185,000 of them. I think, from what I can tell in context, the only people that were left were his personal servants. And so Sennacherib goes home in disgrace. It says, so Sennacherib returned home in disgrace to his homeland. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own sons killed him there with a sword. That is how God rescued Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem from King Sennacherib of Assyria and from all the others who threatened them. So there was at last peace throughout the land, and from then on King Hezekiah became highly respected among the surrounding nations, and many gifts for the Lord arrived in Jerusalem with valuable presents for King Hezekiah too. What's interesting is we have actually discovered the secular annals from Assyria, the Middle East, which actually tell this story, that Sennacherib went home and his sons literally killed him in his own temple because they were ashamed because he was defeated by Israel on the battlefield. So this is a Bible story, but not just a Bible story. It's a story recorded in secular annals exactly the same way the story was recorded in the Bible. And then, of course, Hezekiah is a hero. And so a lot of nations surrounding Israel or Judah start sending Hezekiah gifts, both for the Lord and the temple and for him personally, because he knocked back the Assyrian army and they did not recover for several years to begin to move forward to take Israel again. So he bought them many years of freedom because of what he did here. So just an amazing story. So as we wrap up today, you're going to get some questions that are going to come up on your screen here in a minute. As we wrap up, of course, at the beginning we talked about this very important issue of the man of God being balanced between what we're doing and trusting in God. Look at God's deliverance here. This is a story of the power of God to deliver. And I know that you probably have problems in your life. If not now, you will. If not now, you have. But God is bigger than your problems. It doesn't mean your problems don't matter. It doesn't mean your problems aren't big. It doesn't mean that you're not going to struggle in some of your problems. But here's what I want you to know. When we live on this earth, it's a fallen world, we're going to struggle. There's going to be problems. But here's what we know. When we walk through every problem, God usually doesn't take the problems away. That's not what God's promised us to do. But he says, I'm going to walk with you in the middle of the battle, in the middle of the issue, and I'm going to deliver you. And he does every time. Sometimes it's deliverance of just changing something going on in our heart. Sometimes it's a deliverance of seeing us through successfully through the problem. Sometimes he makes the problem go away. There's many ways that he does it, but here's what we know about our God. When I'm walking through issues, I know he's with me, I know he cares about me, and I know he has the power to do something about it. And he's always working in my heart through my issues to change me and change my character to be more like him. That is who I am. And that is what he is doing in me in my issues. So take that away as your practical application. Next time you're walking through issues, remember God's with you. He's going to see you through. Reread this story when you need encouragement about God's deliverance. So that's our story for today. There's going to be some questions come up on the screen. Discuss those, and I hope you will take these truths and apply them to your life.